In this roundup of a week, Extinction Rebellion protests against damage to the environment by damaging the environment. A study suggests that the contribution to methane levels from fossil fuels is higher than previously thought, and the US Republicans' climate plan gets pushback from some of its own people as the latest Democratic candidates debate makes a Trump second term more likely. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Last year I did a video titled The World's Dumbest Climate Action, which was talking about the Extinction Rebellion action at the Canning Town tube station, where they alienated ordinary people in a significant way and woke up the next day to a sinking realisation that they'd scored a massive own goal. An own goal against the cause that they most care about. Well, this week we saw Extinction Rebellion in the news once again. This time in Cambridge, where in order to protest against climate change, they committed vandalism against the lawn of Trinity College. Because nothing quite protests against damage to the environment like destroying some grass, apparently. They then took some of the soil from the scene of the crime and dumped it at a nearby branch of Barclays Bank. So that showed them. As you might expect, this got a sizable kickback from a lot of people, including amongst people that I know who are generally supporters. Not only were people professing their astonishment at the type of action they'd taken part in, they're also expressing real frustration, even rage, that the Cambridge police had apparently just sat around and allowed them to carry on with what, by any definition of the law, is criminal damage. So, did Extinction Rebellion wake up in the morning, hold their head in their hands and realise they just scored a massive own goal? Heck no. Here's a poll that was held on the Extinction Rebellion Facebook discussion page. Should XR dig up lawns as an act of climate activism? Yes, more please, got by far the most votes. Yes, if a message is made clear, got the next most, which is just another way of saying yes. Only if replanting with wild plants came next, which is just ridiculous, as though putting wild plants onto a lawn that's been treated with selective weed killer is anything other than the flimsiest fig leaf, which actually results in destroying a lawn and killing a bunch of wildflowers as well. And commonsensical, straightforward never got just a humble 9 votes. So, absolutely no self-awareness there, no sense of campaign savvy with regard to what actually makes for an effective way to promote a certain message. And in discussion, what a number of people basically said was that it was all justified because if you do nice things, then nobody pays any attention. As a justification for doing stupid actions of destruction that alienate people from your cause, that is a pretty dumb one. Hey! Let's go around getting support for our cause by slapping people in the face. Sure, it'll be controversial, but it'll definitely be noticed, and that means more people will support us. Right? Wrong. One commentator said this: I think psychologically it's useful for XR rebels to prepare themselves for the inevitable resistance and criticism. In some ways, it means that we're doing things right. We are trying to go against the dominant culture. We are trying to take away the things that our luxurious and planet-destroying Western lifestyle gives us. Yes, resistance is indeed inevitable when you do dumb stuff that is destructive and pointless. It doesn't, however, mean that you're doing things right. All it means is that you're creating conflict. Conflict is neutral as to right or wrong. And there are lots of ways to create conflict. To simply buy into the simplistic notion that if we're successful, they will fight back. You're looking at things way too much within your own bubble. And that's getting in the way of you interpreting the dynamics of what's really going on. Another commenter said this: on the vandalism of digging up the lawn of a posh college and putting some of the dirt in a bank, this is nothing compared to the vandalism of an economic system that is literally destroying the actual planet that we live on. So vandalism's fine if we're targeting posh targets, is it? And these are the people who say there's nothing left-wing about Extinction Rebellion. But of course, this general argument is the one that we hear over and over again. If you think this is bad, climate catastrophe will be worse. And it's something that can be used to justify any stupidity you care to name. And it could, in the hands of real extremists, ultimately be used to justify violence of all sorts. Because if you've convinced yourself that because of climate change, billions will die, Sooner or later, someone will be saying, yes, 100 people died when we downed that airplane, but that is nothing compared to the number that will die. Same principle. And then guess what? At some point it turns out that billions are not going to die. Oops. Well, we meant well. Apparently, one of the sources that influenced XR founder Roger Hallam to claim that 6 billion people would die was a quote from Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Michael Shellenberger recently contacted Rockström and asked him about this, and discovered that whereas the Guardian newspaper had quoted him saying that it's difficult to see how we could accommodate 1 billion people, or even half that, at a 4-degree temperature rise. In actual fact, he'd said not 1 billion people, but 8 billion people. Of course, even with that extremely substantial amendment, he's still offering an extremist, alarmist position. And we remind ourselves that both extremes on this topic have their favoured pet scientists whose opinions and voices they amplify. But ultimately it comes down to the published and peer-reviewed science. And there's no published science that supports the idea that a 4 degrees world, which is not the world in any case that we're currently on course to get to, would only support somewhere between 4 to 8 billion people. But that doesn't matter, because XR's Rupert Read doesn't need published science or even Johan Rockström to give evidence of the approaching apocalypse. He's found something better, a doomsday guru whose authority on the topic is totally unchallengeable, and that guru is, apparently, JP Morgan. And once Reed started tweeting about this, it even got picked up by the BBC. So that's exciting. Somehow he came across a secret report by JP Morgan economists aimed at its clients, where it talks about how utterly apocalyptic climate change is going to be. And this got Rupert very, very excited indeed, because although generally he would not give JP Morgan economists the time of day, these particular economists found favour in his eyes. He tweeted this. Here's a screenshot of the most astonishing and distressing page from the private JP Morgan report that I have been able to help leak. Ooh, you can almost hear the heroism oozing out of every pore. It is clear that the Earth is on an unsustainable trajectory. Something will have to change at some point if the human race is going to survive. And then in his next tweet, more excerpts from the astonishingly truthful JP Morgan report. That's the definition of truthful that says, agrees with my opinion. Although precise predictions are not possible, it is clear that the Earth is on an unsustainable trajectory. Something will have to change at some point if the human race is going to survive. We cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened. Now, obviously, this is like catnip to Rupert, but those of you who regularly watch these videos may be getting a general sense of déjà vu, because it was only a few weeks ago I was talking about a very similar document that was produced in that case by McKinsey. Both documents are produced for clients to promote the company's risk management services. McKinsey's was publicly available, JP Morgan's isn't at the time of shooting this. I haven't seen the full JP Morgan report, but from what we've seen, there doesn't seem to be a lot of difference in their overall tenor. As I said when I discussed the previous document, it had something of a credibility problem because it used the IPCC RCP 8.5 scenario as the basis for its predictions. By and large, the use of RCP 8.5 as a basis for anything has been very much criticised in recent months, since it massively is worse than where we really are in terms of business as usual. Since JP Morgan's document was written by economists, not scientists, one assumes that they did something fairly similar, drawing their climate scenario from the work of others. And it's certainly consistent with the text that would come from RCP 8.5. Let's be clear, there's an incentive for both companies to do that. They're trying to sell risk services. Talking up the potential downside of a predicted risk is kind of a selling point for them. Rupert, however, decides that this is evidence of how JP Morgan is now telling the truth. Just like ExxonMobil knew all about climate change all those decades ago. He tweeted this. Just think about that. The largest fossil funder in the world is openly admitting that if we carry on as we are, the human race will not survive. It's not actually quite what they said. And why would you think that they would suddenly be authorities on the subject? Because you never thought they were before. It's all something of an overreaction for a bit of a corporate sales pitch. As I keep saying, if there's messages we should be paying attention to about the seriousness of climate change, it should come from the published research, not from corporate sales teams. And on that note, there was indeed a new paper this week in the journal Nature suggesting that fossil fuels have made a greater contribution to increasing methane levels than had previously been thought. This created headlines such as this one in The Independent. Climate crisis, fossil fuels impact on planet vastly underestimated. And this one from The Guardian. Oil and gas firms have had a far worse climate impact than thought. Which is a typical Guardian take on all of this. Not, hey guys, all those fossil fuels that we burned in order to pull ourselves out of poverty and expand life expectancies and all of that, they had an unintended impact that we need to deal with. Nope, instead it's all blame. Never mind that you burned those fossil fuels and I burned those fossil fuels. We only did so because of the evil corporates. Because we were happy living in our hovels, barely subsisting at poverty level, dying young of horrible diseases. Remember those times? Those were fun times. And then these evil corporates came along and seduced us into buying all these fossil fuels, and suddenly they made our lives immeasurably better. Despicable fiends. So, we have a problem to deal with. Let's take some responsibility for the fact and recognise that we got here for very good reasons. Anyway, the thing the report doesn't do is to suggest that there's more methane being emitted than we thought. This isn't one of those stories that says things are more urgent than we realised, although some did read it that way. In some ways, it's actually good news. I know. It's saying that of the methane emissions that we already knew were added to the atmosphere, fewer of those are coming from natural sources and more of them from fossil fuels. And that's good news because the level of increase of methane from natural sources was one of those unknowns that some painted in a very scary fashion. And the methane bomb that was just waiting to go off, and as the permafrost melts, we'll get this massive outflow of methane and it'll cause runaway climate change. The science never really supported that as likely to turn into this big runaway effect. But now, with even less of the methane apparently coming from natural sources, one might take that as a positive thing overall. Methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas molecule for molecule than carbon dioxide, but it degrades in the atmosphere relatively quickly. If the use of fossil fuels goes down, it will decline accordingly in relatively short order. So that represents just another level of challenge to the US Republicans, who recently launched their climate plan, which, as I mentioned here a couple of weeks ago, avoids crossing Donald Trump's overall support for fossil fuels. When I originally mentioned the growing initiative within the US Republican Party to start the journey back to the mainstream on climate, I had certain commenters telling me how this showed you know nothing about US politics, and the Republicans would never do such a thing, since that would be an act of betrayal, caving into the libs. Well, last week the House Republicans duly launched their proposals, which looks pretty much like the ones that I'd said. Carbon capture features high on the list, clean energy likewise, and conservation. Representative Dan Crenshaw said the Democrats have trained everyone to think that the only people who care about climate change are the ones who engage in hysterical alarmism or engage in real high-minded but ultimately false aspirations of we're going to decrease this much, but then they forget the actual solutions. Of course, the environmentalists and the Democrats dismissed the package, as everyone would always have expected. That isn't the point, obviously. From a campaign point of view, as I highlighted before, the aim is to reassure the soft Republican vote, particularly the younger voters, that the party is going to get serious enough on this issue so that they can feel free to vote for their party of preference without worrying about climate change inaction. How do we know whether it's a serious initiative or just a PR smokescreen? Well, generally, you know substantive initiatives because they provoke resistance and blowback from the people who are happy with the old way. And so we've seen Representative Thomas Massey, who advocates for more carbon in the atmosphere on the grounds that it will spur more plant growth, said this: "The next step needs to be the trash can for all this stuff." And the Conservative Club for Growth agreed, threatening to withhold support from any lawmaker that backs it. Besides hurting our economy, these measures will not make a single environmentalist vote for a Republican and only alienate Conservatives across the country. Although, as we saw last time, polling evidence of how the issue was seen by Republican voters didn't really seem to suggest it would be a huge negative, certainly not in the rather restrained form of the current proposals. And Republican strategist Matt Gorman agrees. He said, "I don't think voters at the end of the day are going to be voting against you because of this plan, no matter what people say." But the point is that the critics see this in the same way that I presented it in my previous video. It's a first step. Once you begin this journey, it leads inevitably to a next step. Now, that journey doesn't take you all the way to AOC's Green New Deal or anything like that, but it does take you into places that Donald Trump would probably choose not to go. And that'll be an interesting dynamic because, by all accounts, the Democrats remain determined to see to it that Donald Trump gets his second term. This week, we saw Michael Bloomberg join the debate stage for the first time. This was an important moment. You have the radical socialist Bernie Sanders leading the field. He is now the favourite to become the Democratic candidate. And everyone, bar for his committed supporters, believes that will guarantee a Trump win because Americans will simply not vote for someone with his views. You have the would-be moderate candidates in some degree of chaos and confusion, with Joe Biden formerly the leading voice of reason candidate, but with him seriously showing his age and stumbling and bumbling through debates, didn't really seem that he was a credible candidate, and that's been reflected now in his plummeting poll ratings. Then you got Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar vying for attention, but neither of them really able to get the wider appeal that you need. And then you have Michael Bloomberg stepping into the race because he's appalled at the chaos, clear that they need strong leadership if they're going to beat Donald Trump. And he'd thrown his money into advertising, he'd gained some real momentum. With all the chaos and confusion that's been going on, he could step in as the grown-up in the room, the voice of reason, whose business empire is bigger than Trump's, whose success was demonstrable, all of that. And then we got to the first debate, his chance to hit the ground running, and he was awful, just horrible. All of the candidates gathered together to pummel him, and he pretty much begged for mercy. I mean, how is that possible? They were attacking him with the obvious attacks, the absolute 100% predictable, obvious attacks. And when confronted with the controversial policy of stop and frisk when he was mayor of New York, the effective campaign approach would almost certainly have been to own it. To say, during my time, murders went down by half, and the beneficiaries were overwhelmingly the people of colour who are the most common victims of violent crime in those areas. You might well say that there were things about how the policies were implemented, that you changed with experience, and all of that. But you basically sell the benefits, because there were benefits. And we all know that if the outrage mob extracts an apology from you, that apology is never enough and is never accepted. In the context of a political campaign, it's not that you never can, but how and why you do it. You have to be very canny. And then, of course, the other attacks focus on the fact that Bloomberg is a billionaire. And, you know, if the people of any nation respect success, surely it's the American people. The line that, you know, I've built a successful business from nothing, which no one else on this platform has ever done, and that gives me valuable experience, that would have been a strong counter to some of the cases that were made against him. But he didn't say any of those things, at least not in the most important first 45 minutes of a debate. So you have to conclude that the whole appeal of Bloomberg as the ultra-competent grown-up in the room has kind of gone. Now, how does that leave the contest? Very probably in Donald Trump's hands. Because let's face it, it's inbuilt to the American political systems that most presidents get 2 terms. Why? Because unless the president massively screwed up on an area of competence in his first term, then you have a system for second term elections where he remains unchallenged in his own party. But the challenger party spends the first part of the election tearing each other apart and damaging themselves so grievously it makes it highly unlikely they will then be able to win the actual general election. It's a strange old system, but there it is. Anyway, let's go on to one thing that I like and one thing that I don't. First, the thing that I like. The Our World in Data site launched a piece of data that I found interesting this week, which was the amount of global land that we've spared because of how we've improved the yield of crops over the course of my lifetime. Basically, the amount of arable land under crops has stayed nearly the same over the last 55 years. But of course, the number of people those crops have fed have massively increased over the same time frame. To feed the increased number of people at the rate of productivity that we used to have in 1962 would have required just under 900 million hectares more, which is more than double than what we actually did use at 680 million. That's a pretty impressive achievement to bear in mind when people are moaning about what a dreadful mess we've made of the world. Now, of course, it's not as simple an equation as that graph suggests, and we have to ensure that such growth doesn't come at the cost of depleting and degrading soils and all of the rest of it. But before wallowing in the negative, because there's always more to be done, let's just take some satisfaction in an outcome that was by no means guaranteed. And then the thing that I don't like. As regular viewers will know, I talk a lot about free speech on this channel. And I defend the free speech of the critics of climate change to have a voice against those that would deplatform and silence them. But here's a reminder that there are people who pay a much more grievous price in places where there are serious consequences to exercising free speech. Ramiro Gomez in Mexico was a guardian of the monarch butterfly. He was a driving force for the El Rosario Butterfly Sanctuary. He'd do regular tweets with videos of him talking about the sanctuary while surrounded by countless butterflies. He encouraged the public to come and see the spectacular annual migration with thousands of butterflies arriving from Canada. He clearly loved his work, deeply cared for the creatures over which he had stewardship. And at some point, criminal interests who believe that deforestation trumps conservation and, more importantly, trumps human life, murdered this man and left him in a well. 3 days later, they killed another guide at the Butterfly Reserve as well. Gomez had spent his life trying to protect the butterfly from deforestation and climate change. Now, the state seems in no hurry to take action. Indeed, they held a press conference declaring at first that his death was an accident and he drowned, which is fine, but doesn't explain the blow to the head revealed by the autopsy, or why his colleague was also beaten to death with a blunt instrument. More than 50 local police officers were briefly detained and interrogated in connection with the case, which gives you some sense of the rotten state of the institutions there. It's a sad reminder that while we're arguing about the fine principles and trying to make a difference as best we can for some people trying to protect the environment or make other changes, it can literally be a life or death struggle. And that's pretty disgusting. I mean, it gets way too little attention, which means that the perpetrators feel they can keep doing this sort of stuff with impunity. Only 3% of murders are solved in the part of Mexico where this took place. Seriously unpleasant stuff. Let's celebrate and support the people who do what they can in the face of such odds. These people are real heroes. Look, even if you don't much care about the specific cause that they're fighting on behalf, we should still support those who speak freely and campaign when the stakes are that high. They are the ones who really change the world. Anyway, that's all for this week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.